Even the least observant person on the planet could guess these men were brothers. Sophie had known it the moment she'd laid eyes on Bryan outside. They were all over 6 feet, all with dark brown hair and dark eyes. All had wide shoulders and strong chins. But Bryan was the best-looking and easily Sophie's favorite. Any guy who'd give a total stranger an umbrella with no expectation of getting it back, just because she'd been too distracted to remember her coat? Sophie wouldn't be forgetting Bryan Wright anytime soon. And as distasteful as breaking into her lunch had been, he'd shown himself to be kind and patient, explaining each step without a hint of rudeness or condescension. Good thing, because she'd had her fill of rude and condescending men. She'd definitely had her fill of men who couldn't figure out the meaning of "I don't want to see you anymore." Men who thought she needed them to help her, to keep an eye on her home, and let themselves in at the first sign that something might be amiss, as if he had any right. She tamped down a fresh wave of fury. There'd be plenty of time later to fume at her ex-boyfriend, and worry about a break-in at her Munich apartment. Unless Felix was lying about the whole thing, which seemed entirely plausible. She shook off all her suspicions and cut another piece of meat. She had to admit, the lobster was delicious, probably more so because she'd worked so hard for it. Layla was telling her sister what Christmas had been like in Munich. The snow, the markets, the tourists who came from all over the world. Bryan and Derek explained some of their family's traditions. The Wrights, it seemed, celebrated the holiday at a vacation home on an island off the coast. They called the place camp, but what kind of camp had room for a 16-foot Christmas tree, which they cut down themselves on the island? They had to be exaggerating. The whole Wright family would be there this year, including the brother who lived in Oklahoma with his wife and kids, but who was moving back to Maine soon. Fun, the things you could learn if you just listened. Like Sophie, Michael did more listening than talking. He couldn't seem to take his eyes off Layla, whose face was filled with wonder, absorbing the information as if there might be a test. When Sophie had learned that not only had Layla come to America with her boyfriend, but also that they were planning to get married, she'd worried. Sure, Layla and Michael had dated for almost a year, but what did Layla actually know about the guy? Concern for her friend had prompted Sophie to change her plans and fly to Maine for a quick visit on her way back to Germany. She needn't have worried. If the look on Michael's face was any indication of his feelings, the man was smitten. And Layla was clearly in love. The two were kind to each other. They looked at each other with pure adoration, not patient condescension, certainly not possession. Layla had found in Michael what Sophie had been craving for years, a person who loved her for her, not for what she could do, not for what she could add to the world, a person who thought she was worth fighting for. Not that she'd ever say that aloud. What 21st century woman would admit to wanting to be the princess in the fairy tale? Excitement danced in Layla's eyes as she met Sophie's. Can you imagine? A bonfire in the snow? That was another of the Wright family traditions. To hear the guys tell it, the flames rose 50 feet into the air. More hyperbole, surely. But Sophie wasn't going to discourage her friend's enthusiasm. Sounds amazing. I can't wait to see it. Layla turned to Jasmine. Michael says we will roast marshmallows and have them with graham crackers and chocolate. They're called s'mores. Michael chuckled. S'mores. One syllable. I wish to try s'mores. Jasmine said the word slowly, as if she were tasting it on her tongue. You will. This from Derek, whose grin stretched. You'll love them. Sophie wasn't sure about that. She'd never been a fan of the squishy, sticky treats. As a rule, she didn't enjoy getting her hands dirty when she ate. She glanced at the empty lobster shell on her plate. Her fingers had been within millimeters of intestines. It was a testament to the flavor of the meat that she was still eating it. Derek, the youngest brother, seemed happy-go-lucky. Bryan. Now he was a different story, less carefree, more serious, but obviously enjoying the time with his family. Sophie had the feeling the Wrights' Christmas was loud and chaotic, filled with chatter and music and food and presents and discarded wrapping paper strewn across the floor. Lots of laughter, lots of love. Add snow and a crackling fire. All they needed was a sleigh ride to make it the perfect Currier and Ives Christmas. That was how a family should celebrate the holidays. And what kind of horrible person compared her own family's traditions to another's? Her parents would have had a house full of kids, if they could have. If Josie hadn't been born with severe cystic fibrosis that took all of Mom and Dad's attention. Now it was just the three of them. Even years after Josie's death, Christmas was a day to endure, not enjoy. Like Thanksgiving. And Easter. And pretty much every special day on the calendar. Did you like it? Bryan eyed Sophie's plate. She'd eaten all the easy-to-access meat and was considering attacking the legs. She wasn't sure she could bring herself to. How had he explained it? Pull out the meat like sucking toothpaste from a tube? And use her teeth? On the shell? Yeah, no. I did. Thanks for your help. Always a pleasure to introduce a neophyte to the joy of lobster. She laughed. Who uses the word neophyte? He shrugged, maybe a little embarrassed, if the sudden color on his face were any indication. College professors, Michael said on her other side. People who have to prove they're smarter than everyone else. I don't have to prove it, Bryan said. Everyone already knows. I can't help it if my intellect shines through. Michael's eyebrows hiked, especially when you pick words like neophyte. To Sophie, he said, You should tell him what you do. I think he'll be interested. She turned back to Bryan, curious as to why he might be. Let's hear it, Bryan said. I'm interested already. At that last remark, the tinge of pink on his cheeks deepened to red. In your job, I mean. He cleared his throat and sipped his water. She had a sudden, almost irrepressible desire to giggle. Could he be interested in her? Not that it mattered, considering he lived here and she lived in Germany. Too far away for a guy like him to bother. Bryan set his water down. Well? I minister to refugees in Munich. His face brightened. That's how you met Layla? She was volunteering as well. There are tens of thousands of refugees, many from Arab nations, like Layla and Jasmine. The country is generous to let them in, but the people need more than the government can provide. The ministry I work for does what we can for those who walk in the door. And tells them about Jesus, Layla added from Michael's other side. This is why I volunteered there. I don't wish to only give away food and clothes and help people find jobs. I wish to tell people about the one true God. Bryan's gaze was intense. That must be so rewarding. I can't imagine doing anything else. I've heard the most heart-wrenching stories. What the refugees have endured. It's unimaginable. And then they discover Jesus. There's nothing like watching a former Muslim get baptized and experience the freedom of Christ for the first time. Wow. He sounded genuinely interested. I'd love to be a part of something like that. Sophie smiled at Michael. He must have understood Bryan's desire to get involved. But the older brother said, I meant the other thing you do, your paying job. Oh, that's not nearly as interesting. She turned back to Bryan. I work at a museum designing art exhibits. Really? Which one? I doubt you've heard of it. You'd be surprised. Michael's words were droll, almost bored. Bryan flicked him a narrow-eyed glare. I work at the München Meisterwerke Gallery. No kidding. His eyes brightened as if that were the best news he'd heard all year. They're about to have an exhibit of Babylonian artifacts. I've been dying to get over to check it out. Why? He laughed. I'm an antiquities professor. Ancient Middle Eastern artifacts are my specialty. And here I thought you were interesting. Whoa. Had she said that? Teasing him like they were old friends? Wow. He pressed his hands to his chest. I'm wounded. But he was grinning. I know it's not the most fascinating thing to study, but I enjoy it. He was obsessed with Raiders of the Lost Ark when we were kids, Michael said. Oh my gosh, Derek said. That scene with the invisible steps and the... What was it? A cup or something? He must have watched that movie 1,000 times. The Last Crusade. Bryan shook his head, clearly horrified at his brother's ignorance. It was an invisible bridge and the Holy Grail. You know, the vessel Jesus passed around at the Last Supper? Have you heard of that? Derek gave Sophie a raised eyebrow look as if to say, See what I mean? Sophie giggled, then slapped her hand over her mouth. Oh, fine, Bryan said. Join Pick on Bryan Day, why don't you? Layla was shaking her head, amusement playing on her lips. Sitting between Derek and Bryan, Jasmine grinned. They were all so happy to be together, so free and unguarded. What would it be like to enjoy that kind of relationship with her family? Bryan sent his brothers a glare, but he obviously wasn't mad. To Sophie, he said, "Tell me about the collection." She shrugged. "It was donated anonymously a few months ago, and it's going to Iraq after the exhibit." "Anonymously?" Michael asked. "That's strange." She turned to him. "By the provenance, it's clear that the items were looted from the National Museum in Iraq. They've been missing for years." "Since April of 2003, Bryan supplied. "That's right." Michael closed his eyes a moment, nodding. "I remember that story." "It happened after Baghdad fell, but before the U.S. secured the city." Bryan leaned toward his brother, and Sophie, who sat between them. "There was still fighting, or so I've heard. The museum employees abandoned the place for 36 hours. In that time, thousands of pieces were stolen and eventually squirreled out of the country. I think they've gotten back." He looked at Sophie. "About half?" "Something like that. Our collection came from London. There was a huge bust up there early this year, and a bunch of people were charged and sent to prison. The working theory is that the people who possessed the items donated to the museum decided it wasn't worth the risk of being caught with them." "Really?" By Michael's smirk, he was skeptical. "I've never known thieves to willingly hand over what they've stolen." "My understanding," Bryan said, "was that they couldn't sell these pieces. Most of the time, when something like that is stolen, the thieves already have a buyer. But these people were just opportunists, taking advantage of the chaos. They snatched and grabbed and ran. They probably sold everything they could, but the international art community has been searching for the missing items." To Sophie, he said, "I think the items at your museum are some of the most recognizable." "That's what they say." Sophie had never cared that much about ancient artifacts. They were interesting, of course. Anything that had been around for thousands of years was historically significant. But was it artistically significant? Sophie had an art degree. Her interest lay more with paintings. Her favorites were Impressionists. Not exactly the coolest style to study these days, but she'd always had a fondness for beauty. She'd take Renoir over Warhol any day of the week. Not that old clay idols weren't beautiful, except they weren't. "When are they going to be returned to Iraq?" Michael asked. Again, Sophie didn't have a definitive answer. "Before the end of the year, I think." "That soon?" Bryan asked. Michael leaned toward him. "You should go this weekend. You've got a few days off. Those pieces will be easier to see in Munich than Baghdad." He tipped his head toward Sophie. "And I bet she could get you access to all the pieces, not just what's on display." Bryan turned to his brother, and from her seat, she could only glimpse a little of the look he gave him, but his eyebrows were raised, and his lips were turned down at the corners. He was displeased? Or something else? Michael either didn't see it or chose to ignore it. To her, he said, "You could do that, right?" "For sure," Sophie said. "I'd love to." Had Bryan even heard her? He seemed too busy glaring at his brother. Warmth filled Sophie's cheeks. What was she doing, inviting a man to visit her in Europe? A man she just met? A guy shows her the slightest kindness, an umbrella and lobster-eating instructions, and now she was throwing herself at him? No wonder he looked uncomfortable. But it was too late to rescind the invitation. Not that it mattered. It wasn't as if Bryan was about to buy a last-minute flight to Germany to look at a bunch of old clay jars. On Michael's other side, Layla said, "You should go, Bryan. You'd like the Christmas market. It is a great time to visit Munich. I'm sure Sophie could show you around." To Sophie, she said, "Unless you are too busy." Sophie shook her head but spoke to Bryan, trying to make light of the situation. "Do they always work so hard to get rid of you?" I should be used to it by now." If you do decide to travel to Germany someday, could you really get me access to all the artifacts?" "Of course, and I'd be happy to show you around the city." He shifted to speak to Layla. "Do you think I'll be able to get a hotel room? I know it's a touristy time of year." "I can find you a room," she said. "No problem." "Seems like all the pieces are falling into place," Bryan said. "Funny how that happens sometimes." Funny. Yet Bryan didn't seem the slightest bit amused, leaving Sophie to wonder, what was she missing?
I hope you've enjoyed this sneak peek of Finding You, written by Patchen, narrated by Brian, Matilda, and Daniel. Check back soon for the entire audiobook. Meanwhile, don't miss the first two books in the Right Heroes of Maine series, both of which are available in audio on YouTube at Patchen Audio.